This is only the start, and you will hear more good news in the coming days. The Iraqi people are going to welcome those bastards in the way they deserve.
Clearly, when you see a tactic like this, it requires strict adherence or adjustments to your tactics, techniques, and procedures to ensure that places like checkpoints are not vulnerable. So it won't change our overall rules of engagement. It doesn't affect the operation at large, but to protect our soldiers, it clearly requires great care.
But the operation at large is changing. The Pentagon's denied reports of a 4 to 6 day pause in their military advance, though they admit they need more time to strengthen their 300-mile-long supply line to Kuwait, now dangerously overstretched. Air raids will continue, but senior officers admit Iraqi resistance has made them rethink their plans.
What we've encountered is, yes, something slightly different. Paramilitary forces which weren't in the war game profile. But we're military people. We have to expect the unexpected. We have contingency plans. Therefore, they have been brought into action to deal with these forces and have not at all deflected us from achieving our objectives and maintaining our timeline.
In southern Iraq, British troops continue to track down pro-Saddam soldiers around Qaza and Kayal. Tip-offs lead them to private houses where they've been told army officers are hiding in civilian clothing. The raids also reveal stocks of rocket-propelled grenades.
We took about 12 or 13 prisoners, 3 or 4 enemy were injured, and they've now been flown out and we're treating them, including a man who was almost dead with a gunshot wound to the chest. We've now evacuated them out, and the enemy now have either fled or they've been captured.
But other battlefronts are opening up. Tonight, the Arab news station Al Jazeera broadcast pictures of Iraqi exiles returning from Jordan, ready to fight for their homeland. Baghdad claims thousands of Arab volunteers are now heading for the front line.
Peter Morgan reporting there. So what of the story down here in southern Iraq? Well, something very interesting going on now. The British not attempting a frontal assault to take the second city of Basra, not even attempt to do much more at the moment than probing attacks. But the key focus now, something very interesting, they want to take out and destroy, so far as they can, the whole apparatus of the Ba'ath Party, Saddam Hussein's party which controls, or hitherto controlled, this country so tightly. What they want to do is go in and destroy the offices, any symbols of the party, anything that is to do with the party and its means of controlling the people. So really what we've seen in recent hours, really the last 24 hours, is deep probing attacks using tanks and artillery from the outside of the city, tanks and infantry to go in and attack the symbols of the party, its offices, and also radio and TV communications. And they've just completed the deepest probe into the city yet. This morning it was easy to see where the fighting's happening. We just drove up the road and followed the smoke, past abandoned Iraqi positions, where they've been blowing up abandoned Iraqi tanks all day. Smoke from artillery bombardments and burning oil in trenches hangs over a front from Azabaya to Basra. Overnight, the deepest British attack yet into the city to attack statues of Saddam Hussein.
That was a symbolic target, really, just to shatter one of these huge monuments to Saddam Hussein. But the main target really was the TV mast and communication centre from which they broadcast endless propaganda.
Behind me, the biggest battlefront in the whole of southern Iraq, in the mid-distance, Azubaya, and beyond that, in the far distance, Basra itself. The smoke coming from the continuing probing attacks by British forces, but as yet no firm decision on going in and taking the town and the city of Basra beyond, street by street. At Central Command in Qatar, they claim British tanks and US jets destroyed a militia headquarters in the city.
Here are some examples of recent attacks. The first one is an attack against a Ba'ath Party assembly northeast of Basra yesterday evening. He had about 200 members of the Ba'ath Party in attendance.
But as yet, such claims can't be independently verified.
Terror factor, coalition commanders will argue that suicide bomb attacks on checkpoints here and there have little military value, though losing 2 high-tech M1 Abrams battle tanks will worry them. But what of the big battle plan? More supplies are being hurriedly shipped in and 100,000 more troops are being mobilised. But earlier reports that the big thrust into Iraq had been put on hold for between 4 and 6 days are now being denied. Obviously, it's captured in battle yesterday, one job they are getting on with. But after 9 days of seeing American forces tilting headlong into Iraq, whether you call it shaping the battle space or not, these pictures seem to confirm the coalition's race to Baghdad is apparently on hold. Ben Ando, 5 News.
The bombardment of this city continues day and night. Among the buildings hit the Ministry of Information. A missile hit the roof of the building, which during the daylight hours is the base of all foreign television teams, including 5 News. James Bayes, Baghdad, 5 News.
Well, I'm in the back of an armoured personnel vehicle that's protecting a gun battery just west of Basra. And we're seeing a pattern here, which is that it gets an awful lot busier once night falls. And so we've just had a fire mission come down that has meant that they've been firing illuminating rounds in order for a forward observation officer to check for Iraqi movement on a bridge near here. I must admit, I'm not looking forward to the night ahead because we had a pretty jumpy night last night. Mortar fire actually came within about 1.5 miles of this gun position, and that meant we were all scrambling out of our tents and into trenches in the middle of the night. And I certainly hope that we don't have the same kind of situation tonight.
Kathy, we've been hearing the Americans talk about planning for a rest, possibly for as much as 6 days. Certainly what you've just said doesn't sound much like a rest, but what are you being told about what the troops you're with will be doing next?
Well, I can't talk about future intentions for the British military, but I think you certainly are seeing that there is a clear policy over Basra now, which is to maintain steady pressure and to wait for the situation within the city itself to change before there's any change in what the British military are doing. I think they were hoping that that situation would change within Basra once the Americans took Baghdad, or at least attempted to take Baghdad. And therefore, there's certainly a feeling among the soldiers that any delay with the American movement forward is inevitably going to delay their progress into Basra as well. And from their point of view, they just want this over with sooner rather than later.
Firefight between Marines and Iraqi forces. On Friday, U.S. Marines went back into Nasiriyah and recovered what they say were the remains of 5, maybe 6 Marines. 5 of the bodies were recovered inside the burned-out truck, armored vehicle that they were traveling in, that was hit by Iraqi rocket-propelled grenades. And as where they were recovering those bodies, Iraqi civilians approached those Marines and pointed them towards 2 shallow graves. The Marines digged those graves, and they found the remains of what they say could have been the remains of at least other two Marines. And then on Saturday morning, taking some considerable risks because they had to go back into town again, U.S. Marines went back in there and they found 2 more shallow graves, also 2 graves that were pointed by Iraqi civilians to the U.S. Marines, and they recovered there what they believe are the remains of at least 1, maybe 2 Marines. And U.S. commanders here are now telling us that they believe that almost all of the 9 Marines killed in action, their bodies may have been recovered. The U.S. Marines also conducted some house-to-house searches near the site where the ambush took place, where that armored vehicle was hit, because they believe that during the firefight, some of the Marines had sought cover inside one of the houses. And indeed, when they went into those houses today looking for some more bodies, all what they could find were some personal belongings. The military flak jackets, some mop suits, some chemical suits, some gas masks, and even some mail that the Marines had received for their families back home. From here, the bodies of the Marines are handed over to the mortuary affairs, who will conduct a DNA test for positive identification and then prepare their bodies for the final journey back home to the United States. I'm Alex Turinci, CNN, with the U.S. Marines in Nasiriyah.
Blowing up Iraqi armour abandoned in battle. Any pause in the advance of coalition troops is not reflected around Basra, where British soldiers appear to be adopting an increasingly aggressive posture. 6 more Iraqi tanks were destroyed in the latest clashes here, and at the same time, US jets targeted a building where 200 Iraqi fighters were believed to be meeting. Commanders say no one emerged alive. But this is still bandit country. On roads around Basra, soldiers check cars for hidden weapons. There remains a constant threat from militiamen who have blended into the civilian population. These British troops are not under threat in any kind of conventional confrontation with the Iraqi army. The Challenger tank can easily outgun anything it might face on the battlefield. But for troops out here on the roads, the danger is from a hidden threat, an enemy they can't see. The vulnerability of supply convoys and the distances they now have to travel is a growing cause of anxiety. The supply line to these troops in Najaf is around 250 miles. The rapid advance has left frontline soldiers exhausted and complicated the logistics of reaching them.
Going to pull up here and make sure that we're all synchronized to go forward in very, very sound shape. We've been very successful to this point, and it's probably prudent to take these measures.
The people of Basra, meanwhile, may soon be caught in some of the fiercest clashes since the war began. Tim Ewart, ITV News, Southern Iraq.
This is Kuzan. His great misfortune is to be living in present-day Iraq. It's not much of a life. His mother is pleading with Royal Marines on patrol in Qasr. Please help him, she says. He has a bullet in his side. The hospital can't help. Please save my son.
I have a child with an old gunshot wound, Roger so far.
Where the bullet came from and when is never established, but a medic is called out and the Marines move on.
The message we'd ideally like to get across is that in time, their infrastructure of Qasr will eventually be able to help them, and we're going to help kickstart that infrastructure. But in the meantime, whilst in the short term, whilst that infrastructure is still in its infancy, you know, it's extremely important that we help people on an individual basis.
The threat of sniper fire is ever present, but the 4-2 commandos move deep into areas as yet unpatrolled and laden with abandoned Iraqi weaponry. This woman says she believes the drains in her backyard have been used to hide ammunition.
Okay, they're not sure if there's anything else in here.
This is a fraction of the Iraqi arsenal recovered from the town so far. For now, Qasr is deemed to be relatively safe, but many of the people here blame the British for the deaths of relatives in recent bombing. The fear hasn't gone, and the anger hasn't gone.
Why this house? Mr. Blair and Mr. Bush. The British force make this.
We're told that several people here were killed by coalition bombs. If this is liberation, many people don't seem to realise it. They need water, electricity, medical supplies and reassurance. The soldiers need patience and plenty of time.
It was a relentless march towards Baghdad. Now a pause, a regrouping. Coalition forces will halt their advance for up to 6 days. It is what the commanders are calling a need to shape the battle space. They insist it is a normal procedure, an operational pause, designed to allow the frontline troops to re-equip with badly needed supplies. But at the Coalition Command Center, the American Director of Operations insisted the war is still going according to plan.
Our plan remains unchanged. We continue to focus on movement of logistics support up to our units. We've had, as you may have seen from some of the embedded reporters, consistent movement of long lines of supplies up to the forces. That's going fairly well, not without some engagements by some of these Iraqi irregular forces.
This morning, British troops were continuing their operation on the outskirts of Basra, Iraq's second city, a major focus for the UK forces, here manning this checkpoint near the main bridge in the southern outskirts. But as their work here goes on, the dangers continue. Another British death from so-called friendly fire. UK commanders have confirmed 1 British soldier was killed, 5 others injured, when 3 armoured vehicles on patrol in the north of Basra came under fire from the air. It's thought an American A-10 tankbuster plane was responsible. Meanwhile, defence officials are denying that up to 5 British soldiers have been captured in Basra. Reports overnight suggested 4 or 5 had been taken, but chiefs at the Allied Command Centre in Qatar insist no British personnel have been reported missing. At this morning's military briefing in Kuwait, reporters were told the ruling Ba'ath Party is now the primary focus of the military effort in Basra.
Our effect on Basra must be to convince the people to have the oppressive political control of the Ba'ath Party and the irregulars, thus targeting and eradication of the Ba'ath Party is now the critical effect we need to achieve.
The coalition advance on Baghdad will now be paused. Supply shortages and heavy Iraqi resistance are taking their toll. Chris Ship, ITV News.
Distinguish them from combatants. But if every civilian has to be treated as a potential suicide bomber, it's an extra strain on a force already stretched. The Pentagon said it looked and felt like terrorism.
So it won't change our overall rules of engagement. It doesn't affect the operation at large, but to protect our soldiers, it clearly requires great care.
The United States is already starting to deploy more forces to defend its supply lines. Today, the 101st Airborne was being airlifted forward from Kuwait to southern Iraq. A whole new division is joining the battle. Brian Hanrahan, BBC News. Began to move out.
Every image the coalition keeps telling us is just a snapshot, and today they produced some vivid snaps of their own. This, they said, was a nighttime attack by the US Rangers in the deserts of western Iraq. The result, they said, 50 Iraqis captured. The message, they said, this is not a campaign which is pausing.
With respect to a pause, there's no pause on the battlefield. Because you see a particular formation not moving on a day does not mean there is a pause on the battlefield.
But out on the battlefield, some units are pausing briefly. After 10 days, which, whatever the coalition commanders may say, have been much tougher than many had expected, there's a need for regiments which have been in the thick of the fighting to rest and replenish, and for soldiers to have a few moments to reflect. There's also a pressing military problem which must be dealt with. Supply lines are long and vulnerable, and the coalition has got to overwhelm Iraqi resistance, much of it mounted at night, in all the towns along the road to Baghdad before they can contemplate any ground offensive against the capital. A map based on information from the Pentagon shows the extent of the problem. The coalition may have swept north and covered a lot of territory, but the ground which it claims is mostly empty desert. The all-important roads and towns, like Nasiriyah, Najaf and Karbala, are virtually all still posing a major problem. Commanders are now offering sobering assessments.
I would think the toughest fighting is ahead of us. You never know. Regimes like this that have their power base in fear and intimidation tend to topple fairly quickly.
Some reinforcements are already waiting in Kuwait and are expected to move north soon. Other units are on their way from America to join a campaign which is posing major challenges.
Suspicion, especially after today's suicide attack. At roadblocks, passers-by are frisked for weapons. It means huge queues of frustrated Iraqis, people trying to leave the city, and surprisingly, perhaps, people also trying to get back in. British troops continue to besiege Basra, and today they sent in tanks on a symbolic mission to destroy 2 statues of Saddam Hussein. Iraqi fighters fired back with rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns.
A few hundred or even a couple of thousand people is a minuscule minority, but nevertheless they can put up a decent fight, as we know from Chechnya and Grozny and so on. That sort of guerrilla tactic against armoured vehicles is very effective, and they know their way around the city through the lanes and the nooks and the crannies.
Resistance may be stubborn, but the British 7th Armoured Brigade believe they can wear it down with regular raids into the city. So while British troops here on the outskirts of Basra are still biding their time, they are also carrying out penetrating